I don't believe in the rapture, and once I stopped waiting to be raptured out of here, Revelation started looking very different. I'm going to say something that'll probably upset a lot of Christians. I don't believe in the rapture. I don't believe we're waiting for believers to suddenly disappear from the earth before everything in Revelation begins. Why? Because I started paying attention to the timeline Yahusha himself gives his disciples. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. They asked him about the destruction of the temple and the events surrounding it. And Yahusha tells them, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Not a generation 2,000 years later. This generation. And throughout Scripture, 40 years repeatedly marks a generation. Israel wandered 40 years. A generation died in the wilderness, and approximately 40 years after Yahushua's ministry, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed in AD 70, exactly as Yahusha warned. So instead of asking, when is all of this finally going to happen, I started asking, what if it already did? And that's when everything changed for me, because the next question people always ask is, if Christ already returned, wouldn't somebody have recorded something? Here's where history gets fascinating. Josephus records extraordinary signs surrounding Jerusalem before its destruction. Tacitus records strange phenomena. Later writers such as Eusebius preserves accounts of supernatural warnings, and other traditions describe armies, chariots, and soldiers appearing in the heavens. Does that automatically prove the second coming? No. But it made me ask, why do these historical accounts sound so much like biblical judgment imagery? And then I got to Revelation chapter 20, because I've been taught my entire life that we're waiting for the resurrection. But Revelation 20 verse 4 says they came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. That's the first resurrection. And don't skip over the next part. They reigned. They ruled as kings. Well, kings over who? Because if everyone on earth had already been glorified, who exactly needed to be ruled? That's when Isaiah 65 suddenly became incredibly important to me, because look at the world Isaiah describes. Babies no longer dying after only a few days, people living extraordinarily long lives, someone dying at 100 being considered young, people building houses and actually getting to live in them. They plant vineyards and actually enjoy what they planted. Their labor isn't taken from them. They don't build something just for somebody else to possess it. And every time I read that, I can't help thinking about our world we live today. You can spend 30 years paying off your house and still owe property taxes forever. Isaiah is not describing our world. But here's something else. Isaiah 65 isn't describing Revelation 21 either, because death still exists, sin still exists, judgment still exists. That sounds like a kingdom being governed, which brings me back to Revelation chapter 20. The saints reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and then the 1,000 years end, and Satan is released from his prison, not forever, for what Revelation describes as a short period before the final judgment, Satan's little season. And suddenly I started looking at history differently, because what if we're not living before the millennium? What if we're living after it? What if we're living during the deception? That's where my investigation gets controversial, because I started looking at stories of mud floods, buried buildings, massive underground catacombs, enormous cathedrals covered with saints, old world buildings supposedly constructed by populations that seem tiny compared with the scale of architecture. Then there are the catacombs, skulls, femurs, bones stacked beneath cities. And immediately my mind went to Ezekiel chapter 39. Birds summoned to feast upon the fallen, also in Revelation 19. Then the land is cleansed 7 months, bearing the dead. Am I telling you those catacombs prove Ezekiel 39 already happened? No, I'm telling you why I started asking questions. Then there's 2nd Esdras, a text included in some historical Christian Bibles, taken out of Protestant Bibles, part of the Apocrypha. It describes an extraordinary transition involving silence and a world in which humanity disappears before another age, and then history seems to explode with mysteries. Asylums filled with enormous numbers of people labeled insane, orphan trains carrying children across the country, children separated from their origins and placed into completely new families and communities. And I started wondering, what happens if you want to reset a civilization's memory? You don't necessarily have to convince the adults. You teach the children a different history, a new generation, a new timeline, a new story. Then look at Isaiah 66. Yahuwah describes survivors being sent among nations that had not heard his fame. And one of those places specifically named? Greece. Then centuries later, what language dominates the surviving New Testament manuscripts? Greek. Coincidence? Maybe. But I'm going to keep asking questions. Then I started looking at the architecture we're told came from the old world. Massive Capitol buildings, cathedrals, train stations, government buildings, structures built during what we're taught were horse and buggy civilizations. And I started asking, did we build all of this or did we inherit some of it? Then come the civilizations and geographical names people argue have been forgotten, misunderstood, or deliberately erased. Tataria, Mu, Tierra de Iso, old maps that don't always resemble the story we learned in school. Calendars changed, maps changed, historical timelines reconstructed, and if Revelation 20 says Satan's primary weapon after his release is deception, then shouldn't we at least consider what a worldwide deception would actually look like? Maybe it wouldn't look like Satan standing in front of you saying, I'm Satan, with little ears and horns and a tail. Maybe it would look like confusion, conflicting histories, conflicting religions, conflicting timelines, conflicting identities, and symbols whose meanings we've completely forgotten. Look at artistic depictions associated with Lucifer and broken chains. Then look beneath the Statue of Liberty, a broken chain at her feet. Does that prove she's Lucifer? No. But once you start questioning symbolism, you start noticing things you never noticed before. And now we're entering another era. Aliens, UFOs, non-human intelligence, beings supposedly arriving from the heavens. And Christians need to be extremely careful because Revelation 20 doesn't say Satan's final mission is to merely to scare humanity. It says he deceives the nations. And what happens after the deception? He gathers them, Gog and Magog. An army so enormous, Revelation compares them to the sand of the sea. And where do they go? Revelation 20 verse 9, they surround the camp of the saints. That's the final battle. So no, I'm not waiting for the rapture. I'm waiting for deception because my interpretation of scripture is no longer rapture, tribulation, second coming, millennium. Instead, I'm asking whether Yahushua fulfilled his promise to that generation, whether the first resurrection already occurred, whether the saints already reigned with Christ, whether the 1,000 years are behind us, and whether Revelation chapter 20 is telling us exactly where we are right now. Satan has been released. The nations are being deceived, and the final gathering has begun.